The news of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine being approved, it has to be universally welcomed. But I guess what it means is more lockdowns until enough people have had it.
Yes, it's good news to hear that we've got a vaccine, and let's hope it works as it says on the tin. I mean, vaccination has been a universal good for people and for medicine over the last 100, 200 years, and let's hope this one works. The real problem with the whole approach we've been taking, though, is that it's based on three key things. It's based on the level of the threat that we perceive this virus to give us, the fact that the responses that we've been making, the lockdowns and the face mask wearings work, and the fact that the sacrifices we've been making are worth it in terms of the benefits. And unfortunately, all those things are not true. The original threat of the virus was greatly overestimated, and the government and in fact SAGE haven't really moved much on their appreciation of that since, even though we know now that it's well within the envelope of many of the past years. The response is lockdowns don't work. There's lots of evidence to show that there's no correlation between case incidence and the severity of lockdown measures in many countries. And finally, the sacrifices that people have been making. The fact is, this is mainly in the name of protecting the older generation of the population, and in fact it's causing direct harms to these people. So really, I'm afraid the whole approach is flawed, even though I'm delighted that hopefully the vaccine will give us a route out.
Well, I certainly have felt for many months now, especially those summer months when the cases came down, that it's pretty clear that the healthy population should have been allowed to get on with their lives, and we should have considered some kind of focused protection for the vulnerable. No one's going to argue with that. No one wants to let rip. I wonder, though, Dr. Lee, whether this new variant of COVID-19, which appears to be more infectious, and the sight of ambulances queuing up outside A&E departments are such an unedifying spectacle, so unpalatable to the British people, that at this point we've now got to just suck it up and wait for the vaccine.
Well, I think the trouble with it, I mean, obviously we live in a postmodern world and everybody has their opinion on this, but I believe there is a centre of gravity of truth about all this, which science can find. And the trouble is, what people think they know about this virus and what's actually really truthfully happening are two different things. The government, in terms of understanding how many people have got this virus, you mentioned 50,000 cases today, they've been equating positive tests with cases, and this is fundamentally medically and scientifically wrong. And the fact is, on testing, they've gone for cheap and nasty with the testing. And the fact is, it is cheap and nasty. They're trying to roll out these hundreds of thousands of tests a day in unverified, uncontrolled settings with a technique, PCR, which is not fit for mass testing and is generating huge numbers of false positives. So, for example, I mean, my mother, who's 85, is in hospital at the moment, and she's suffering the unpleasantness of being isolated from her family and trying to work in a hospital which really is trying to tie itself in knots to stop a virus spreading. It can't do it. She's caught the virus anyway. But the fact is, I think what's happening for a lot of these hospital cases is that you're getting false positives in old people in hospital who are then kept in hospital because of the COVID rules, giving them time to catch a hospital-associated infection, which they're then dying of, and then it's recorded as COVID. And unfortunately, I think this misattribution of everything to COVID is absolutely rife in the country, and it's completely skewed people's appreciation and understanding of what's happening. And it's very difficult, I think, really to row back from this now. So what we need is a way out. I'm delighted the vaccine is here. I think there are concerns over how effective and how long effective the vaccine will be, because when you apply a huge selective pressure to a virus, it will evolve. So the new variant is not surprising at all. It's exactly what you might expect to have happened, on the back of lockdowns, if nothing else. And I think the vaccine will simply mean that the virus will move sideways, and in a year's time there'll be another new variant, or in 6 months' time there'll be another new variant, which maybe the vaccine will be less effective for. But we have to learn to live with this virus. It's not sustainable to stay in lockdown forever, and governments around the world simply need to get their head around the fact that actually they're doing a lot of direct harm by these lockdowns, and they should let most people get back to their normal lives while providing care for people who reasonably need it. And
John, I completely agree. Now, at no point in the pandemic has the NHS looked close to being overwhelmed. The Nightingale hospitals have gathered dust. They are monuments to scientific ineptitude, in my view. However, even the most lockdown skeptic commentator and observer would be concerned about this explosion in cases. Now, you're absolutely right. Of course, a positive test does not necessarily mean a case, because how accurate are those PCR tests, for sure. But even just the broad graph, the broad sort of direction of travel is that more people are getting COVID, and admittedly it's non-fatal to almost everyone. But dare a government risk the NHS being overwhelmed and hospitals overflowing? I mean, you're an NHS consultant. You'd have to have a heart of stone to make a decision that could potentially see a victim of a car accident being turned away from an A&E department. And surely that's what this is all about at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, there are two aspects to this. I mean, and I don't have a heart of stone. I'm quite a nice guy, I think. I mean,
Absolutely,
I
of course.
want to look after people, but the question is, how best do you look after people? And the thing is, number one is how many people really have COVID, and that's a very difficult thing to ascertain. Number two, how different is this year in the NHS from normal years in the NHS? Every winter we have an NHS crisis, and I'm afraid that shows a lack of political will in providing appropriate provision. We have a quarter the number of acute beds in this country compared to Germany per head of population. That's just not good enough. Why are the Nightingale's hospital mothballed? Why were they not turned into infectious diseases hospitals so that we could put COVID cases there and actually allow the NHS to function more normally? And when people say, oh, well, we couldn't staff the COVID hospitals, well, I'm sorry, we've had 9 months to sort this out. It's quite possible to staff hospitals at a lesser level perhaps than NHS if you make them infectious diseases hospitals, but there's been no political will to do so. So I'm afraid, of course we don't want the NHS to be overwhelmed. I don't think it's that different this year from normal years, and the government's been very coy about the numbers, for which I cannot see any justification for the secrecy other than it doesn't really suit the narrative. But the fact is we don't want it to be overwhelmed, but there are other ways of dealing with this, which meant that the NHS could function properly, we could deal with COVID, and the rest of us could get back to our lives. And in fact, the sooner we do get back to our lives, the sooner the pandemic will be over, because once enough people have caught this virus, they'll have their own immune systems dealing with it. The vaccine will help us along that road, but I'm afraid the virus will be, as they tend to be, a step or two ahead of us, forever, because that's what they do.
Dr. John Lee, you certainly don't have a heart of stone, and we always appreciate your views on this. Thanks very much for your time. Dr. John Lee is a former professor of pathology and former NHS consultant pathologist. I'll put